No mai, haere mai, welcome to More Than Theology, the Pathways Bible College podcast. Today I've got a great guest, Karl Udy. Karl and I have known each other for a long time, but just recently reconnected at a conference that we were both at. And I discovered that Karl has been quite busy in the 20 odd years that I knew him during his days doing campus ministry at Waikato University. And in that time, he's become a digital strategist. He leads digital strategies for Tandem Ministries. What led him, or the qualification he did to get to that point, was a Masters of Communication Studies at AUT, looking at digital communication. He is, like I mentioned before, somebody that I've been connected with for a while, and part of that connection where we see each other a bit is that we're both part of Triple CNZ churches and have been for a long time. Before his current role, if you go back a bit, he's served as a missionary overseas, as well as been involved in mission and ministry in New Zealand. So, Karl, welcome to More Than Theology. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here.
Tell us you're a digital strategist. So, what does that mean?
Well, it doesn't mean that you want me to fix your computer because I wouldn't do a very good job of that.
Mm,
And actually, there's probably a lot of confusion about digital strategy. It's a term that's used. Digital strategy is a term that's used with lots of different meanings, but in terms of what a digital strategist is, perhaps the best way to explain it is comparing digital strategy with IT strategy. Now, an IT strategy is essentially asking the question in terms of what you're doing of how can we do this digitally? In other words, with digital technology, how can we do this thing that we're doing? Whereas with digital strategy asks a different question of given the digital environment, the digital world that we live and operate in, what should we be doing? And so my role as a digital strategist working in a mission organization is figuring out what does it mean to do mission work in a digital world? What does it mean to help fulfill the Great Commission in this world that is infused and saturated with digital technology?
great. Very important question for us all to be asking. So, a bit of a dull question perhaps, but important nevertheless, just so that we make sure we're all understanding and talking about the same thing. When we talk about digital technology, like what are we talking about exactly?
Digital technology is digital technology that uses or creates digital data. And in terms of digital data, you need to think in terms of digital versus analog. And probably the best example of this is to think about a clock, because most of us are familiar with both a digital and an analog clock. And with digital, everything is built up of ones and zeros. So it either is one thing or it isn't. So it's a very clear thing. Whereas with analog, it could be anywhere in between, and you're not sure which. And so that's you think of your digital clock, you think of your analog clock, and you get a very precise. This is exactly the time on a digital clock, and you get something where it's in between 5 past and 10 past on your analog clock. Now, the advantage of digital data is that it enables you to actually deal with data on a much greater scale, and so you can deal with huge amounts of data. And so we have different technology with computers and now the internet, which allows very high speed and very large amounts of data to be processed. And it facilitates things like this conversation that we're having now, where we can be in different cities, having a conversation, seeing each other's faces with that amount of data that just would not be possible um, for us to do with technology that we have just sitting in rooms in our home with analog technology.
Mm, mm, yeah, definitely, world changing. What led you to this area of specialization, Carl?
So when I was serving in Hong Kong, working to reach university students there, I remember one time when we had an early morning prayer meeting and then breakfast afterwards. And at the time, I had what you'd probably describe as a half smartphone. So it had a little 2 inch by 2 inch screen. Um, and but it did have a screen, and you could record or store videos on it. And so I had a video of my son doing a kung fu routine. And I played this video on my half smartphone, and everyone crowded around to look at this video on a not very high resolution screen. And I was amazed at how captivated people were and how willing people were to watch videos on such a small screen. And I started to think about, well, what if I could have something on my phone like this that could be used to start a spiritual conversation? And that sort of began the journey for me of exploring ways that we could use digital technology to help in our mission of bringing the gospel to students, discipling students, sending them out. And uh, and so there was a guy in my church who was in the early days of Facebook at the time. He was an early adopter with this, was building Facebook apps, had one that went mega viral at the time, and I started working with him on some projects as well. And we at one time had a global campaign where we launched a video that had an animated short film about Jesus that went out around the world. And when we did that launch of that video, uh, that global launch, it was the same year that or it was the same weekend that the cloud crashed. And
Oh, wow.
this was at a time when the idea behind the cloud and cloud data was that it never crashed, and so it was a server that would never crash, but it crashed. And so it was a really amazing opportunity. We could see from that weekend, we could see the potential of it from those few times in the weekend when it was actually up, but also seeing how with the the vagaries of technology falling over and so on, that uh, that there were these obstacles and hurdles that we hadn't yet overcome, but the potential was definitely there.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
So when you were considering or having these kind of moments that kind of set you on this path, did you have any pushback, not necessarily from others, but just internally, in that, in a sense, you're charting quite a different path into ministry than a lot of people would take. It's not just the sort of traditional kind of, pastoral work or what have you. It's something kind of coming at ministry in a quite innovative way. Was there anything that was holding you back from that, or were you just all in?
So I think throughout the history of ministry, and especially in the evangelical church, there's been a history of adoption of technology. So if you think of radio ministries, and also televangelists, um, something like the Jesus film. Which came out in 1979. So there's been this history of making use of technology, and the Jesus film was actually birthed out of the organization that I serve in. And so this idea of being innovative in the use of technology was not something that was foreign, was not something that was looked down on, although any new technology, there are people that have hesitations and reservations about it, and in a lot of cases, rightly so.
Mm, yeah, it's actually interesting. Just as you're saying that, I'm reminded of a book on. It's called "Watching TV Religiously" by Cutting Calloway and Dean Batali. This is where your field and my field kind of overlap a little bit, but they note the fact that there's a sort of funny inverse relationship between how ready a particular tribe of Christians have been to adopt new technologies, and how innovative they are in their theology, if you like. So evangelicals, we're traditional with our theology. That doesn't tend to change so rapidly or markedly, but we've always been quick to adopt new communication technologies. And I don't think that's just evangelicals. I think we see that throughout the church's history as well, and I can see that that missional impulse means that when we see a new technology or that little video on a half smartphone, something in us goes ding, maybe that's a new way that we can tell the story of Jesus. So I'm really excited about that, that you've taken this route, because I think it's something that, I mean, it's so pervasive in our culture, isn't it? That we need people like you who are experts or becoming experts, or a little bit more expert than everyone else, or whatever how you want to say it, and so that we can all, I think, make the most of the technologies that we have in ways that are wise. So you obviously care a lot about digital technology. Why do you think the church should care about it too?
It comes down to the fact that we live in a digital world. And so, uh, given that the church's mission, um, in terms of the Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations, if that means that we're doing that in a digital world, then we need to care about digital technology. One of the realities about technology is that all technology changes us, uh,
Mm,
and and so this is something which we often overlook is the effect that technology has on every one of us. And so all of us around now, we are essentially digital people. We live in a digital world. We also live in a physical world. We're in a sense amphibians, and we don't even notice when we're actually switching in between the two. And a lot of times we're doing both at once. And so, because we're reaching people who live in this way and whose lives are digitally entangled, um, because we care about people, because we're discipling people, we need to care about digital technology because this is part of what makes people who they are today and what makes societies what they are today.
mm, mm. No, that's great. So another Kiwi working in a similar sort of field is Stephen Garner, formerly of Laidlaw College. He a while back he co-wrote a book with Heidi Campbell, Network Theology, and in it they just outline a little simple typology about how we engage with new technologies. So they've got a technological pessimism. That's one way that as Christians we could approach technology. Um, B, technological ambiguity. C, technological optimism. So just again, technological pessimism, ambiguity, optimism. Where should we be in that typology?
Yeah. Now I know that Stephen and Heidi, uh, they make the case for us having a technologically ambiguous approach
Mm,
about adoption, and I would really agree with that because the key thing that they talk about there is about thinking critically about the technologies that we adopt, what effect that they're going to have on us, and so on, instead of having this view that technology is good or technology is bad, which are two very common views.
mm,
Although the third very common view, and this is perhaps one of the things where I'd like to clarify a little bit about this, because the most common view I've come across in the church is this idea that technology is neutral. And technology is not neutral. Technology is going to have a moral effect because technology is used by moral beings, that is us, human beings, and so it is going to have a morally good or a morally bad outcome depending on how it is used. It's never going to be strictly neutral. And although we can think of some technologies where you can think, well, yeah, just depending on who is using it, it might be good or bad. The reality is that technologies, in terms of how they're designed, they may have a particular bent that leans more towards good or evil.
mm,
You know, one of the uh, one of the easy ways to see an example of this is with some of the weapons technology that we have, where we can see that weapons technology, if you think about things like machine guns and so on, have a lot more potential for evil than they have potential for good.
mm.
You could maybe make a case for a good use of a machine gun, but you might be stretching things a little bit, especially if you like to say, well, that might balance out the potential for evil that's there.
Mm.
Now, in terms of digital technology, you have the effects of the technology may be a lot more subtle than the effects of a technology like machine guns.
Mm.
And so we do need to think very carefully about this. Andy Crouch, who wrote a book called The Life You're Looking For, has four really good questions for us to think about as we're critically evaluating any technology, including digital technology. And the first two questions he have are questions that we tend to ask, and they tend to be reasons for us adopting technology. The first one is, with this technology, what am I now able to do? And so that's often a motivation for us adopting a technology. Well, if I have this technology, I can now do this. The second question is, if I have this technology or with this technology, what do I no longer need to do? And again, that's often a very conscious motivation for us adopting technology. So I have a dishwasher, I no longer need to do the dishes every day. And so these are, we just need to put them in the dishwasher, and the dishwasher will do that work. But there are two other questions that often get overlooked. And those questions are the questions of, what can I no longer do? And what do I now need to do? And if, one of the common things that's part of our current generation is ideas of Wi-Fi or battery anxiety that people have about their phones. And so
Yes.
I have my phone, and so I now need to keep my phone charged. You know,
Mm.
that's something that I need to do. And so if my battery on my phone gets low, I'm thinking about, okay, I need to find a place where I can charge now.
Mm.
Before I had a mobile phone, I wasn't worried about that at all. Uh, and there are the things that I can no longer do or can no longer do as easily. It's much harder to switch off and get some alone, undisturbed time with our digital technology. It used to be that when you're on a plane, that you got that respite from being able to be contacted. Although now with Wi-Fi on board, a lot of plane flights, that's no longer a given. Uh, but these are some of the questions that we need to be asking, and asking about every technology that we're thinking about adopting. We definitely need to be applying that technological ambiguity, which means asking those questions as we're adopting technology.
What stops you from becoming overly pessimistic as you consider that? Are there moments where you, as you're thinking critically, I mean, you touched on it a little bit before in your own story. You see the potential, you see the opportunities and the things that it can open up and create. And how do we kind of get that balance right, or make sure that we don't end up just all pessimism or perhaps all optimism?
Yeah, so uh, we live in a world that is embedded with risk. And there is a sense where the Bible calls us to embrace risk. If you think about the parable of the talents, um, the servant who buried his talent in the ground
Mm.
was not praised by the master at all. And so the idea of considering safety above all else is not something that is a Christian virtue. Um, it's not that safety isn't important, but it is not one of these overarching or governing values that we have. You think about the C.S. Lewis quote about Aslan, where he's not safe, but he's good. And so there are dangers, there are risks with digital technology, but living life as a Christian is about managing appropriate risk. And there are always going to be risks that we're taking. The big danger with dealing with risk is when we are not aware of risks and pretending that we can actually completely insulate ourselves from risks is actually quite risky, because that probably means that there are risks that we're not aware of.
Mm.
And so, uh, yes, there are dangers, there are dangers online, and these are things that we need to be aware of, and we need to have plans for. But the reality is that this is where the mission field is. This is where the sheep that we are called to shepherd are. And so we cannot insulate ourselves or pretend um, that we as God's people can be completely insulated from this. And so we're called to go out into that. And so I think that's something which is important to remember. But then at the same time, again, realizing that those risks are there, that this technology is technology that is created by fallen humans living in societies that are flawed and have flawed systems. And so our technology is going to be products of that. And so if we're looking at technology to bring about some sort of a utopia, then that's a false idol, a false god that's only going to disappoint. So we need to see the potential for good and bad in technology in general, and then as we do that with wisdom, with God's wisdom, we can hopefully make good choices to choose to use technology in a way that brings about human flourishing, and minimizes the human harm that's caused.
It's good. We started talking a little bit earlier in the conversation about the way that the church has often engaged with technology or adopted it. Just picking up that thread a little bit more, if we look back on, the church's adoption of technology throughout history, what are some of the lessons that we should be learning for today from the past?
Um, Thinking particularly about the evangelical church, one of the key things that I've noticed about the evangelical church is that one of the values is pragmatism, and pragmatism has uh, some very good points to it. We definitely want to be practical in what we're doing. If something is not working and does not bring any value, then we do need to actually question it. And so pragmatism has that good value in it. However, it can very easily lean into utilitarianism. And when you get into that territory, then things can get very, very dangerous in that you can overlook risk, or you can justify um, harm or things that are happening because of the greater good. One of the things that I noticed, one of the key findings that came out of my thesis I did for my master's, was that within Christian charities in New Zealand, there were three very clear strands of how these charities, which most of them were churches, were approaching how they use digital technology. And there was about a quarter of the churches had an approach which I described as being uh, digitally inactive. And so that may reflect a technological pessimism, to use Stephen Garner and Heidi Campbell's term, where they actually look to use digital technology as little as possible. And then you had a smaller group, maybe about 10 to 15%, where they had what I called a digitally proactive approach. They were looking at using digital technology wherever they could see value of it. They were very proactive in finding out how they could use technology. They were early adopters. They thought a lot about how digital technology could be used, and they persevered in the use of digital technology despite the hiccups. But by far the highest the highest group, the largest group, was one that I described as digitally reactive. Now, the interesting thing about this group was that they used digital technology as much as a digitally proactive group, but they were not nearly as strategic in the use of it. They, uh, for them, the frustrations that they experienced in adoption were more likely to result in them making U-turns about that and not persevering. And uh, and they ended up having a much less thoughtful approach in how they were using digital technology. So they wanted to take the time to evaluate things, but they often end up making rush decisions and making decisions that were motivated most by budget and what they felt comfortable with using at the time, what they had the skills to use at the time. And so with some of the quotes that came out of that, they were saying things like, what technology that you use is not even a theological question, or
Mm.
it doesn't really matter what technology you use. And so these were questions that sort of raised a bit of red flags with me in straying into that pragmatism. And so I think that for us as, as members of the evangelical wing of the church, these are things that we need to think very carefully about, because as pragmatism, although it's motivated by a desire for practicality, it can have blind spots which can lead us astray.
Mm. That's a great point. I think it's almost, as you've been pointing out, it's almost in our DNA for those of us who are evangelicals. We just want to get on with the job, get out there and preach the word, share the gospel. And I've been in church leadership, and I know what it's like. It's the theological questions behind these sorts of things are often skirted around or assumed, but you're advocating a bit more thoughtful approach. And I think it's fascinating that the digitally proactive and reactive groups aren't necessarily using it different amounts. They're all using it somewhat, but one's doing it very, very thoughtfully, and one's sort of just diving in a fairly ad hoc and figure it out as we go kind of way. So that might lead us to the next question then, which is just what would you like to see churches doing better on the digital front?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Richard, I think just taking the time to think about it more. Think about, who are we as a church? What are we called to? And so where does digital technology fit into what we're called to? I think those sort of questions are really important questions for us to be asking and taking the time to think through that. Another thing that I would suggest is talk to other churches. Uh, One of the things that came out of my research was that uh, churches and charities were not actually taking a look and seeing what other churches are doing and having that influence their decisions. They tended to be a lot of the time going off on their own, and so they weren't developing that collective wisdom about what works. And I think one of the other things, and I think that this is perhaps an even more important thing, is in terms of investing in digital, I would say to invest in people over
Hmm.
technology. Digital technology will change. You will adopt a particular tool, a particular platform, and you'll find that platform or tool will become obsolete over time, and you'll need to replace it, and it will cost money. Um, I would uh, advocate on investing in having people who are equipped to lead your church digitally as being a far greater investment. They will be able to adapt with the new technology and help lead the church through that. They will build up their experience over time, whereas if you're just investing in the technology, then you can actually lose what you learnt when you change from one technology to another or have to start all over again. But investing in the people is a much better long-term investment. So I'd say if a church has an opportunity to think about, okay, we have this amount of money to invest in what we're doing digitally, I'd say look at a way that that can be invested in a person or in people as opposed to being invested into equipment or technology.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So, what's your thoughts? I'm putting you a bit on the spot here, but when we step back from digital technology and try and look at it sort of big picture rather than just say individual technologies, but the sort of the whole thing and the kind of culture it creates, one of the kind of common critiques, whether that's articulated or whether it's just expressed in a more sort of gut level kind of way, more implicitly, one of the common critiques is that it takes us away from embodied real community, face to face, actual face to face, not the sort of face to face that you and I are doing over video chat. So, like, what's your thoughts on that? Is that a genuine problem here and one that we need to be aware of? Yeah, just give me your kind of off the cuff thoughts on that particular issue.
I think this is a really critical question for the church to deal with. And I think it's something that needs to be talked about a lot more. I was at the Lausanne Congress in Seoul earlier this year, and one of the working groups I was looking on was actually that very question of digital
Wow.
communities. And there are there are two things that are happening with in terms of that. One is you have some real innovators who are doing amazing things in terms of digital communities, and there is real community that is happening there. Uh, People really do connect digitally. And there are questions about, is that connection of the same quality as a face-to-face connection? And these are really good questions to ask, and we need to investigate and actually develop our theology of the body more,
Yes.
our ecclesiology more, where we can actually include these questions and actually develop answers on these questions, have research about these things, because at the moment, the research is very sparse, and this will not get into the training that we have for pastors and for church leaders if the research doesn't happen at that academic level, and then we're able to actually have these answers on, okay, what does this look for? What does this look like? And how do we apply this in a way that is faithful to the gospel? And and so we need that so that we can have the confidence to move forward this, and so we can actually know, okay, this is how we can do this in a way that actually is in accordance with how we should do things in a Christian way. And so we need to be asking those questions. We need to be researching this more. And it's going to take time before we actually get this fully fleshed out.
Mm.
And it is going to, the answer is perhaps going to be a little bit different depending on what technology we do use. Um, However, one thing that I will say, based on, you know, we've all been through the experience of COVID where we had to do church online. And
Mm.
for a lot of us, it was harder than turning up in person to church on a Sunday morning. However, there are a couple of things where things went a little bit against what would be expected, a little bit counterintuitive. One was there are several churches I know who did church on Zoom, and they had breakout rooms for prayer or things like that. And I heard from several different people in different churches saying what a great experience they had with having a conversation with someone who they never would have talked with had they been in the church building.
Mm.
And so the digital technology was able to facilitate a connection that happened with people in the same church that wasn't happening in the church building space that we normally had.
Mm.
Another issue is the people for whom the church building on Sunday morning doesn't work. And so there are people who are homebound. There are people who are carers for people who are homebound. There are people who uh, are not able to drive. Maybe they don't have a car. Maybe they're just not able to drive. There are people who are living remotely. There are people who are shift workers. And so these people can feel excluded from the activities of church. And online church actually found a way for their participation to actually be made a lot easier than normal. And I think that's one of the reasons why, despite the fact all the COVID restrictions have gone, a lot of churches have continued with streaming their services to provide a way for those people to connect. There's a lot of evidence out there that that community does happen online. There are questions that we need to ask about for how we do church in a way that is faithful to how Jesus called us to. Is digital technology, or how, when we use digital technology, is a way that is going to keep us faithful to Jesus' calling? And we need to be asking those questions.
Mm. Yeah, and like you said, even at that quite academic, seemingly abstract level, it's still important to get that right. I'm just thinking, I mentioned earlier in the conversation a couple of thinkers, or one in particular, Cutter Calloway, and he wrote a book with Dee Batali, but Calloway and Batali, they talk a little bit about the fact that in Augustine's writing, he talked about the fact that communication is mediated. It's always mediated, even if only through our body. And God's communication with us is ultimately mediated through the Word, Jesus Christ. But it's always all communication's mediated. It's just how and what are the implications of that, and so on. So yeah, it's kind of heady, abstract sort of stuff, but getting that kind of right, I think then will flow into everything else, and hopefully head more in the proactive rather than the reactive kind of direction.
Yeah, exactly, Richard. We need to do that thinking, and so it's vitally important that thinkers in the church are actually utilized to help lead the church through these questions, because we live in a world where there are so many of these questions and new questions coming up all the time that we as a church need to navigate.
Yeah, and you're one of those people, Carl, in this particular area. You've done a lot of thinking and study and all that sort of thing. So, to me, you're a real resource for the church here in Aotearoa, and your network of churches and so forth. So, how can churches and other ministries connect with you? What kinds of things can you offer them to help them become more digitally proactive and figure out their digital strategies? And just how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm always open to having a chat with someone about this. So probably the easiest way to contact me is via email. So my email is karl.udy at tandem.org.nz. So that's Karl and UDY. So uh, have to spell both of those out because otherwise they get spelt wrong. And so you can contact me that way and be happy to have a chat. I'm also available if you would like me to, come and speak to your church or do a seminar or a workshop. I'd be happy to talk about that. Uh, and yeah, I want to make myself, available out there for people that want to talk through and think through these things. For some people, just a simple half-hour chat might be enough to get them on their way.
Mm. Yeah, and just a quick little plug from somebody who lectures. Carl joined in with a session with some of my students earlier in the year to talk about this sort of thing, and it was a really enriching kind of component to the class. So those of you who are involved in theological education, I think, can make good use of Carl too. We'll put those contact details in the show notes. Carl, it's been really great to have you here. Audience, Carl doesn't know this yet, but I'm going to have him back again because this is such a big topic that we've got other things we need to explore in this area. But hopefully this is a good a starting point. And yeah, as Carl said, if you've got a church or a ministry that needs to get a bit a bit more strategic in what it's doing digitally, then he's your man, so get in touch. But yeah, Carl, thanks so much for being here. It's been great.
Hey, thanks, Richard. It's been awesome.
Great. Ka kite anō.